The U.S. president is demanding Europe's help in Iran. EU leaders say maybe later.
There is no clear indication that there is a proper proposal for a mission.
I'm Carolyn Beeler. We will look at the divide between the U.S. and Europe and ask whether there is a divide between the U.S. and Israel.
I don't buy the notion that somehow they're fundamentally divergent and there's all this tension between the two sides.
Plus, former Sinn Féin leader Gerry Adams is on trial. Victims of violence during the Troubles claim he was an IRA ringleader.
Everybody else in the world seems to know he was. He's the only one who doesn't seem to know that.
Also, Muslims around the world will soon feast after a month of prayer and fasting.
You kind of break your fast with a sip of water and a handful of dates, and then you go at it.
That's all ahead on The World. The war in the Middle East is topping the agenda today as European Union heads of state begin a two-day summit in Brussels. President Trump has been calling on European allies to send military support to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. But so far, Europe's leaders have rebuffed his demands. In Brussels today, French President Emmanuel Macron called for a de-escalation of tensions.
Alors que la région entre dans une période de fête religieuse,
as the region enters a period of religious celebration, he says, referring to the end of Ramadan, I think that all sides should calm down and stop the fighting at least for a few days to try to give negotiations a chance. For more, here's the World's Europe correspondent Orla Berry.
Kaja Kallas, the EU's foreign policy chief, has been clear about where Europe stands on the Iran war.
We were not consulted with the objectives of this war. Where does it go? It's not clear. So therefore, the feeling is this is not Europe's war.
Keir Starmer, the UK Prime Minister, said this week that Britain wasn't about to get involved either.
We will not be drawn into the wider war. I want to see an end to this war as quickly as possible.
While Spain's Prime Minister Pedro Sánchez has been fierce in his opposition to the conflict, a view he repeated in Brussels this afternoon.
We are against this war. We are against this war because it is illegal, there's no reason behind it, and it's causing a lot of damage.
But others, like Dutch Prime Minister Rob Jetten, indicated that some European countries might be ready to help reopen the Strait of Hormuz. Just not right now.
The Netherlands is ready, together with France and others, to protect the European partners. But at the moment, there is no clear indication that there is a proper proposal for a mission. And it's also, at the moment, too volatile to start a mission in the Strait of Hormuz.
President Trump has repeatedly called on his NATO allies to send military vessels to the strait to help restore safe passage through the region. Around a fifth of the world's oil is transported through the Strait of Hormuz, and this week Trump slammed those allies for rejecting his demands.
I've long said that, I wonder whether or not NATO would ever be there for us. So this was a great test, because we don't need them, but they should have been there.
This afternoon, though, some NATO countries seem to indicate a shift in their position. Leaders of Britain, France, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands and Japan issued a joint statement condemning Iranian attacks on vessels and calling for an immediate moratorium on attacks on civilian infrastructure. They were ready, they said, to contribute towards appropriate efforts to ensure safe passage through the strait. They didn't give any more details about what that might mean, though. The price of gas in Europe is already more than double what it was before the war started. And Ed Arnold, a senior research fellow with the Royal United Services Institute in London, says that's putting pressure on European leaders to act.
Europeans are really in a very invidious position because obviously now with the strait closed, that is a huge political and economic concern to Europe. So Europeans may sort of feel compelled to have to support that type of operation to, amongst other things, keep inflation down at home.
But EU leaders are also mindful of domestic public opinion on the war. Surveys across several EU countries this month show the vast majority of Europeans are opposed to US-Israeli actions in Iran. Louise Kettle, an international relations professor at the University of Nottingham, says European leaders, like Britain's Keir Starmer, are also wary about repeating the mistakes of the past.
He's made clear that he's not going to go to war where there's not a what we call in military terms phase 4 planning available. So what we mean by that is what happens after combat, post-combat operations, what next? And at the moment that doesn't seem to exist. And so Keir Starmer is saying, we've learned the lessons from Iraq. We're not going to go to a war where that's not clear.
For one European country, the Iran war impacts on much more than just food or petrol prices.
Putin will want a long war. For Putin, a long war in Iran is a plus.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky told the BBC this week that a war in Iran could mean a weapons shortage for Ukraine, as US resources are directed elsewhere. Today, Europe's leaders had further bad news for Zelensky. A €90 billion loan destined for Ukraine has been vetoed by Hungarian leader Viktor Orban. Eli Gerenmaya with European Council of Foreign Relations says European leaders need to think about how to persuade President Trump to bring an end to the war in Iran.
I think it's a shared interest for the Europeans and these neighbours of Iran to ensure we don't go down another instance of state collapse and state failure, because the size of Iran is magnitude bigger than Iraq, it's magnitude bigger than Libya in terms of population size. So it will have major repercussions for all these countries, including Europe, whereas the US sits comfortably oceans away from this situation.
Each day the war continues, she says, the global repercussions are being felt more and more. The only sustainable way forward is de-escalation on all sides, she says. For The World, I'm Orla Barry.
We will have more coverage of the latest developments in this fast-changing war later in today's show. When most countries talk about tackling climate change, they are focused on reducing emissions coming from energy, burning coal or oil or gas for heat or electricity or transportation. In Brazil, though, it is a different picture. Most of that country's planet-warming emissions come from destroying forests. And the government in Brazil has just announced a goal to end all deforestation in just 4 short years. Frederico Salmi is a sociologist focusing on climate change. We reached him in Brasilia. And he said the issue of forest loss is not just connected to Brazil's increasingly intense wildfires.
It's not about deforestation by fire, but by agriculture. Mainly cattle. So we have a lot of this territory in Brazil right now that's advancing. More than 50% of the territory of Brazil nowadays is related to some agricultural activity. This is so important. We have this missing link in Brazil. It's not the forests that are burning, are the big agro business that is moving over the forest.
Right. You have agro-businesses clearing land for farming, a lot of soy, and also for grazing cattle. And so the land is burned, and when the trees are burned to clear the land, the carbon stored within the trees goes up into the atmosphere, and that is how this process is a big driver of climate change. Is that right?
Yeah, it's perfect.
So this goal to completely end deforestation by 2030, which is in just 4 short years, is it realistic?
No, for sure. No, it's a delusion. No. All the data from the last 15 years shows that the deforestation doesn't stop. Because we have this kind of goal that's kind of not a legal target, a legal goal, but it's a kind of a goal that is possible politically in terms of narrative. So in Brazil in particular, we have this kind of issue. We have a completely disconnect from narrative and official narratives when we're talking about climate goals and the practice.
So there's a difference between setting these goals and then actually making the policy to make them come true.
Yeah, for the same federal government.
Stopping or slowing deforestation has been a policy priority for President Lula da Silva. How much progress, has any progress been made under his leadership?
For sure, there is some progress, but it's far away from the real goal. And that's the real point. Just an example. we have some deforestation slowing process. Not stop, slowing.
Slowing.
But at the same time, we have, for example, some kind of law that are approved to drill more oil and gas in Amazon region. So it somehow will have the slowing down deforestation, but at the same time, let's drill more on the Amazon forest.
And that has to do with deforestation because you need to clear land in order to put up oil and gas infrastructure?
Yeah, for sure. This is another kind of activity that you are, how can I say, new activity, legal activity inside and on Amazon forest. So it's not about only deforestation, because deforestation is a large category. But what kind of all the activities that are eating the Amazon forest? That's the question. We have burning, we have fire, we have floods, we have mining activities. Now we have oil activities. In the past, we have agribusiness activity, and it's still going on.
And anything that clears the land of trees, even if it's not burning, when those trees eventually decompose, they release carbon into the atmosphere. So that's how all of those activities are drivers of climate change. So what would the government of Brazil need to do to make this goal, or maybe a slightly less ambitious one, realistic? How could they stop deforestation?
The real solution is change the energy matrix and stopping, invest, and promote agribusiness in Brazil. So we have to make an ideological and economic change, a system change in how to govern.
To both energy, but also you're saying to agrobusiness. So a huge part of Brazil's economy, growing cattle, growing soy.
Just to have a big picture, we have big agribusiness, big oil, and big mining in Brazil. All of three respond for more than 95% of all the greenhouse emissions in Brazil. These three big sectors. So in order to have a real change in Brazil, we have to make not greenwashing politics, but we need real Green New Deal in Brazil.
You did say that President Lula da Silva has been able to slow deforestation, which is some progress. What have the successful policies been that have allowed that to happen?
There is some law in Brazil that they are speeding in order to protect, for example, indigenous lands. So this is a kind of law, the kind of policy that works really good in Brazil, because in the First Nation territories in Brazil, they really preserve. So not from public, state, and neither from private sector, for sure. We have to recognize these lands from the First Nations in Brazil, because we have more than 100 First Nations territory that are still waiting for this kind of official recognition. And this really works in terms of slowing down deforestation.
Frederico Salmi is a climate change sociologist at the Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul in Brazil. Ahead on the show, European leaders may be waffling over whether to join in the war with Iran, but what about the United States and Israel? We ask whether they are still marching in lockstep in this third week of war. Plus, America is bombing the Persian Gulf island of Kharg. We'll hear the history and significance of the island being hit. You're listening to The World. On the 20th day of war with Iran, the U.S.-Israeli alliance is showing signs of strain. President Trump posted on social media that the U.S., quote, knew nothing about what he called Israel's violent strikes on South Pars. That's the world's largest natural gas field shared by Iran and Qatar. Trump's statement is raising questions about whether the aims of Israel and the U.S. are diverging, like a question at a press conference this morning. A reporter asked Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth why the U.S. is helping Israel prosecute this war if the two countries have separate objectives.
We hold the cards. We have objectives. Those objectives are clear. We have allies pursuing objectives as well. And the truth speaks for itself.
But President Trump has named many different goals for the war. To get one expert's view, we reached out to former State Department Middle East analyst and negotiator Aaron David Miller. He joined us from Washington.
I don't buy the notion, frankly, that there are major differences, fundamental divergence of objectives between the U.S. and Israel. I think this is a war of choice, but in this war of choice, without clear definition on the American side, I think that U.S. and Israel from the beginning have been strategic partners. In fact, I cannot identify a single consequential military operation that the U.S. has undertaken with any ally. I think you'd have to go back to World War II to find an example of the kind of coordination and integration that has occurred between the U.S. and Israel. And we're now in the third week of this war.
So you do not interpret those remarks where President Trump appeared to be distancing himself from this particular attack as any sort of evidence of divergence in the goals between the two powers?
The Israelis and the Americans have a similar objective here. Even though the president has, again, said it's regime change on one day, it's not on the other.
Right.
I think that the U.S. and Israel both are looking at a minimum to fundamentally weakening the regime, to create so much dysfunction, so much fracture, that the current regime has a extremely difficult time recouping and regenerating itself. I think even while the administration won't admit that that's the goal, I think that is the goal. And I think the goal of the Netanyahu government is a minimum is that, and more, they want the regime to crack. And again, they're prepared to accept the level of chaos, perhaps, that the administration is not in Iran. But I don't buy the notion that somehow they're fundamentally divergent and there's all this tension between the two sides.
Tell me more about that statement about what I think I heard you say was that Israel is more willing to put up with more chaos in Iran than Washington is. Tell me more about that.
I mean, look, Israel is not encumbered or in any relationship with the Gulf states. The Israelis are not attached to the global oil economy in a way that the administration is. Benjamin Netanyahu is under no domestic pressure, as President Trump is. The Israelis are in the neighborhood. They could live with a level of chaos and dysfunction for quite some time. In fact, I'm sure from Benjamin Netanyahu's electoral prospects, he would like this war to go on for another 2 or 3 months. He cements his relationship with President Trump. He changes the conversation from Palestinians in Gaza to an issue on which most Israelis are united, that is to say Iran. And remember, 2026 is a critical year for Benjamin Netanyahu. It's more important than Iran. It's more important than Lebanon. It's more important than Gaza. That is to say, the government goes to term in October. You'll probably see elections before that. And this is the way this prime minister is going to ride himself to another term.
Is there any difference in appetite or willingness to attack energy infrastructure and oil supplies in Iran and in the surrounding areas?
There may be that because, again, the administration is under enormous pressure now. I mean, look what they've done. There's a report this morning that they've unsanctioned Iranian oil.
Yeah.
They've allowed the Indians to buy Russian oil. They've provided waivers for the purchase of Russian oil. They're not going after these ghost tankers. Netanyahu is not under that pressure. President Trump is. And if you ask me, do I think there would come a point when Donald Trump would say to Benjamin Netanyahu, enough? I think there would. And I think Benjamin Netanyahu would comply because he cannot be reelected unless the president of the United States, who is more popular in Israel than he is an active campaigner on his behalf. So Trump has enormous leverage. If, in fact, Trump and the Pentagon were truly fundamentally bent out of shape or angered by a divergence of targets, for example, Trump could have easily said to Netanyahu, stop. And Netanyahu absolutely would have done it.
Is Israel capable, if it wanted to, of continuing attacks without Washington's capabilities behind it?
Yeah, I don't think there's any doubt.
Okay.
The war, in fact, may enter another phase of less kinetic energy, fewer attacks, with the Israelis carrying out black ops, assassinations of Iranian scientists and leaders, and episodically using military force. But again, if Donald Trump makes the decision that he's done and that he's won, he'll communicate that to Netanyahu and he'll say jump, and Netanyahu is going to say how high.
It is very hard to predict actions from this administration, but do you have any sense of what that line would be, that President Trump, the White House, would say, okay, no more?
I don't. This may have been a war of choice on February 28th. With the closure of the straits and Iran's capacity to continue to rocket and drone attack on the Gulf states, this is now a war of necessity. And I think this could go on literally for months. Pete Hegseth requested $200 billion to the White House. The Pentagon clearly is planning on an extended campaign, which may involve an American effort solo, maybe afterwards with some Japanese minesweepers, to open up the straits. That's weeks from now and months from now.
Trump has business interests in the Gulf. Do you think that will be a factor here?
Yeah, he does. And he also now has deployed his son-in-law and his best friend to negotiate 3 core conflicts that are extending at the same time, 2 of which have significant financial and economic advantages for his son-in-law, for his business partner, Steve Witkoff, and for him personally. No, I think even Trump understands now that what he's bought into now cuts to the core of his presidency, of his image as a leader, of his capacity to deploy power and to make America great again. I think that's where we are in this. Could he tomorrow basically say we've won and stop? Sure, if there was some understanding with the Iranians that they would stop. But they are not content with just regime survival. They're not content with imposing costs on the global economy and on the Gulf states. What they want is to create deterrence. They want this to end with the clear reality that there is a cost to going to war with Iran. That's their goal. Whether or not they'll be able to achieve it is unclear, but that's what they want to do. And that's why they're not going to stop.
That was Aaron David Miller, formerly with the U.S. State Department. Ahead, the housing market. In a city, people have been leaving. You're listening to The World. This is The World. I'm Carolyn Beeler. We've been looking at the cost of housing this week. That cost has risen dramatically in the last decade in cities across the globe. The standard explanation for why is not enough homes. But in the capital of Venezuela, the story looks different. Years of economic collapse pushed a quarter of the population out, meaning there are lots of empty apartments, abandoned buildings, and a frozen housing market. Now, something unexpected is happening. The World's Tibis Isaiah has the story.
A real estate agent is showing an apartment in Caracas. It's been sitting empty for years, like many homes in the city. The owner left Venezuela for Chile nearly a decade ago, at the height of the economic crisis. She locked the door and never sold, because prices had fallen so much. The owner's sister, Payomar Cruz, has been keeping an eye on the apartment.
Bueno, ella decidió hacer una vida en Chile mientras tiene el apartamento aquí.
She says prices are starting to rise, so they are putting the apartment up for sale. Until recently, apartments like this one were hard to move. For nearly a decade, Venezuela's housing market was in free fall. More than 8 million people left the country. Some tried to sell their homes. Others just left them behind. Because renting wasn't a good choice, Cruz says.
Sí, muchísimo. De verdad, dio muchísimo miedo por eso, porque uno no sabe las expectativas.
The laws tend to protect tenants, and she worried a tenant might never leave. So many properties stayed empty, and caretakers kept an eye on them to prevent squatters from taking over. Others were sold at steep discounts just to get rid of them. But now that's starting to change, according to real estate agent Irene Duran.
Los inventarios que nosotros teníamos ya se han agotado porque hay mucha más intención de compra de inmuebles.
She says demand is rising. especially from Venezuelans in the diaspora. Some are thinking about returning. Others are investing for the first time after saving some money abroad. There's no official data tracking Venezuela's housing market, but interviews with agents, homeowners, and buyers across Caracas all point to the same trend.
El mercado inmobiliario viene sufriendo unos cambios. Son más notorios desde enero.
Duran says the housing market shift became more noticeable after January. That's when U.S. forces captured President Nicolás Maduro, a dramatic turning point for the country. Since then, there's been growing talk of political change, of new investment, especially in the oil sector. And even if much of that is still uncertain, for some, it's enough to feel optimistic. But experts say that optimism may be getting ahead of reality.
Todo eso ha alimentado el valor de los inmuebles por simple expectativas.
Economist Asdrúbal Olivero says prices are rising on expectations, not necessarily on real demand. In some cases, prices have gone up so quickly that the units are not selling. And the underlying problems Venezuela has had for decades have not changed much, he says.
Los factores estructurales que afectan el mercado, como la falta de crédito o construcción de viviendas.
There's still no real mortgage system, he says, so buyers have to pay in full. Banks don't offer loans, and there is zero construction going on.
La mayoría de los venezolanos, estamos hablando del 90% de la población.
Olivero says about 90% of Venezuelans have no access to loans and can't afford to buy a home. Years of hyperinflation wiped out people's income. And even as rents fell, many couldn't afford living on their own, so they moved in with family. So while this market appears to be opening up, it's only for a very few, Olivero says.
Es un proceso lento y complejo para volver a ver un mercado hipotecario más robusto.
He says rebuilding a functioning housing market will take time, and deeper economic changes are uncertain at this point. Foreign oil companies are still cautious after years of expropriation and political instability. So even with new interest, a full recovery is far from guaranteed. But that uncertainty hasn't stopped people from hoping things will change. Maria Steinberg is in her 70s. She moved to Spain 7 years ago and is still holding her 2 apartments in Caracas.
Yo, mi apartamento no lo voy a vender, porque alguna cosa yo me voy para allá.
Because for her, those apartments are more than property. They are a way to keep a door open to home. For the World, I'm Tibisay Sea.
Before we leave Venezuela, a quick update on the political situation there. The country's acting president, Delcy Rodriguez, announced a cabinet shakeup today. She has appointed a new defense minister who will replace a loyalist appointed by the ousted authoritarian leader, Nicolás Maduro. Maduro is detained in the U.S. on drug trafficking charges. We will keep following the changes and shakeups in Venezuela on The World. Closing arguments are being made today in a civil case against former Sinn Féin party leader Gerry Adams. The purpose of the trial is to determine whether Adams was a member of the Irish Republican Army, or IRA. The group led a decades-long fight in Northern Ireland for independence from Britain. And Adams is accused of orchestrating or participating in IRA bombings and murders. He has long denied any involvement. Ilya Meretz reports from London.
In June 1996, a Manchester-based railways manager named Barry Laycock was planning to go on a week-long vacation with his wife. Before leaving town, he went into work to take care of some things. Inside the station, Laycock saw a growing crowd and a man with a megaphone telling people to clear out. While Laycock was phoning for help, a massive truck bomb detonated just outside the station, shattering windows and injuring hundreds. ITN covered it.
The bomb, which was loaded onto a van, exploded at around 11:20 this morning with devastating effect. Parts of some buildings were completely destroyed.
It was considered miraculous that no one was killed that day. Laycock is now in his 80s, and the injuries to his spine and leg are still painful, he told ITV News earlier this year.
I have to have a morphine patch on 24/7, to control the pain if possible. It's not always possible to control the pain.
Today, he is one of 3 claimants seeking to hold Adams directly responsible for 3 bombings inside England, 1 in the 1970s and 2 in the 1990s. Laycock and the other claimants are each demanding a symbolic payment of £1.
I would like Mr. Adams to tell the truth. This is what it's all about. I want him to tell the truth.
The case is built around the testimony of former British military and police officers and some former IRA members. They say Adams' high position, his movements, his networks, it all points clearly to Adams being in the IRA, approving the violence. Adams' legal team contests that. Where is the proof, they say? This question of Adams' role reached millions of people through the 2024 Disney Plus drama Say Nothing, which was based on a nonfiction book of the same name. Here in the program, Adams is interviewed in a nationally televised broadcast.
So this is quite something for voters to get their heads around. Marshall, it's not every day we've a candidate for Parliament who also supports the murder of British soldiers.
I don't support the murder of British soldiers.
Do you not?
I don't support the murder of anyone.
You support the armed struggle of the army. Support people's right to defend themselves.
Last week, I watched as a former Army intelligence officer deployed to Belfast in the early 1970s was asked by Adams' lawyer if he had seen Say Nothing. He said he had. And did that show and any other media just possibly contaminate your memories? Adams' lawyer asked. Absolutely not, the witness testified. This particular witness was seated behind a screen and identified only as Witness A. That's a safety measure that was common during the armed struggle. Kieran McAvoy is a professor of law and transitional justice at Queen's University in Belfast. He says Adams has often been accused of being in the IRA. But obvious, as it might seem to some,
it's quite difficult to prove, actually, So the IRA, for example, reorganized into a cellular structure at one stage in the 1970s. And part of the purpose of that reorganization was limiting information between units. So units had a degree of autonomy.
McAvoy says the evidence just isn't there for a criminal case against Adams. But he says this civil suit does have a chance because the legal threshold isn't beyond a reasonable doubt. It's on the balance of probabilities.
It's a different standard, obviously, for a civil, so it's kind of, the way I used to explain it to my students is like 51% to 49, So it'll be interesting how much credit the judge will give to this kind of evidence, which would not work in a criminal trial.
On Tuesday and Wednesday, it was Gerry Adams' turn to speak. At 77, he still has a full head of hair and a thick beard. Under cross-examination for hours, he kept his cool. I don't distance myself from the IRA, he said. He believed then and now that the Irish people have a right to defend themselves against a foreign occupier. Again and again, Adams said he was never in the IRA, had no knowledge of its internal workings, and did not plan or approve attacks. Some of his critics hate him because he made peace, he said. Each day outside the court, 2 small crowds gathered, each hoping the judge will see things their way. Frank Glynn is an Irish activist who's been in London since the 1970s.
Gerry Adams, in a way, is our Mandela because he's a man of peace. At the end of the day, it was Gerry Adams that put the Good Friday Agreement together. It was Gerry Adams who called off the war.
A few feet away is Mick Petru, a veteran who was deployed to Northern Ireland in the late 70s and who does not buy Adams' denials that he was in the IRA.
Everybody else in the world seems to know he was. He's the only one who doesn't seem to know that.
Northern Ireland never had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission like South Africa's. Kieran McAvoy, the law professor, says that means there are many unanswered questions and unsolved murders. More than 2,000 donors gave to a crowdfunding page to support the suit against Adams.
So this is an interesting case because it is, in effect, victims trying to use the courts as a tool of truth recovery.
A win in this case would mainly be a moral victory for the claimants, McAvoy says, but a determination that Gerry Adams was in the IRA could invite more litigation. Victims may soon have other options. The UK and Ireland have jointly committed to a new legacy commission to seek facts and justice. The 1996 blast in Manchester that caused Barry Laycock lifelong injuries was the very last IRA attack in England before the Good Friday Agreement brought peace, a peace that has held. But no one has ever been held responsible for the bombing. For The World, I'm Ilya Meritz, London.
Gas fields and refineries are now targets in the U.S.-Israeli war on Iran. Last night, Israel struck a refinery in the South Pars gas field, which accounts for roughly 70% of Iran's gas production. Iran responded by firing missiles at a refinery in the Saudi capital of Riyadh. A focal point of attacks has been Kharg, a tiny island off the Persian Gulf. The World's Shirin Jafari explains the island's role and significance.
The sound of sirens puncture the quiet night on the island of Kharg. The red flashes of sirens light up the sky, making the towering silver oil infrastructure visible. On March 13, American jets dropped bombs on the island, which sits at the north of the Persian Gulf. They destroyed the military parts of it, but according to a post by President Trump, the most critical parts were spared. He said it was, quote, out of decency that he didn't order the complete obliteration of the pipelines.
Kharg Island is Iran's main crude oil export terminal.
Gregory Brew is a senior analyst at the Eurasia Group.
And this is also a facility that Iran has relied upon for a very long time. It was originally built in the early 1960s. It has been the focal point for Iran's crude oil exports since that time.
The island has a number of berths that can accommodate large oil tankers, and that means a heavy volume of oil can be exported from these facilities. The U.S. used bunker-busting bombs to destroy the military targets on the island, Trump said. After the attack, U.S. Senator Lindsey Graham, who has pushed for a war with Iran for years, went on Fox News and had this message for the president.
Mr. President, take Kharg Island. This war is over.
Trump has given conflicting messages about sending U.S. troops to the island. Experts like Gregory Brew say this would be a challenging mission.
U.S. troops positioned there would be vulnerable to Iranian counterattack. Again, the island is only around 15 miles off the coast. It is well within range of Iranian missiles, Iranian drones, Iranian rockets. Even Iranian artillery could reach the island.
The Iranians may escalate further, he says, by bringing in the Houthis, the Yemeni group that has struck ships in the Red Sea in the past. Today, the president dismissed the idea of sending troops. But since the attack last Friday, it has been difficult to get news of any possible deaths and casualties on the island. A small population lives there, and the internet shutdown imposed by the Iranian government since the start of the war has made it almost impossible to get information from the ground. Alex Shams is an anthropologist and writer. He has studied Iran's islands.
Kharg Island is a beautiful coral-rimmed island in the Persian Gulf. It's a desert island, but it's kind of surrounded by beaches, and then it's also a very historic island.
There are several ancient monasteries. Kharg Island was a center of Portuguese colonization, so there's a small Portuguese fort and a few religious shrines, Shams says. In the 1500s, he adds, the area was a major trading port.
The Persian Gulf was part of a larger Indian Ocean trading network and served as a kind of vital connection point between the Middle East and the rest of the Indian Ocean.
The Portuguese invaded and occupied these islands and used them to expand their colonial presence in the Middle East. But eventually they were driven out of the region, Shams says, but some of their influence remains. After the discovery of oil in Iran in the early 20th century, Kharg Island evolved into a hub for refining and transporting oil to the rest of the world. Because of its significance to the country's economy, the government paid attention to its security, Shams adds, setting up military installations for its protection. But aside from the infrastructure, and maybe somewhat surprisingly, the island is also home to a population of gazelles. The fate of which, after the U.S. bombings, is unclear.
When we think about war, we often think of the human casualty, and that is really important. It's really central. But there's also a lot of animals that are being affected by this war. And it's also having, these weapons are often having long-term chemical effects.
The majority of the people who live on the island work in the oil industry. Today, U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent spoke on Fox News about the attacks on Kharg Island.
If you're an oil worker, you don't want to work there. So all the oil workers there are being coerced to stay there. And, we will see what happens with whether that eventually becomes a U.S. asset.
He said, quote, "We will see if Kharg Island becomes a U.S. asset." For The World, I'm Shirin Jafari.
You're listening to The World. This is The World. I'm Carolyn Beeler. As Ramadan, the Islamic month of fasting, comes to a close, Muslims will celebrate Eid al-Fitr, the festival of breaking the fast. It's marked by 3 days of communal prayer, family time, and naturally, lots of food. Paul Salopek has been walking around the globe for the past 13 years, and he's seen a number of ways Muslims across the Middle East and Central Asia observe Ramadan and Eid al-Fitr. My co-host Marco Werman caught up with Paul to hear more about that.
Paul, it was really one of the first countries you passed through on your global trek on foot, where you were immersed in the meaning of Ramadan and Eid al-Fitr. We're talking Saudi Arabia. What year was it, and how did you get there?
Yeah, as you mentioned, Marco, my project is across the world. I've so far walked through 21 countries. 14 of them were either Muslim or had large Muslim minorities. But Saudi Arabia is the core. It's the homeland of Islam, and that was basically summertime. Ramadan was, believe it or not, July or August, walking across the deserts of Saudi Arabia. It was a hot time.
I can imagine. Now, Saudi Arabia is home to some of the holiest sites in Islam. One of them, the Al-Masjid Al-Nabawi, the Prophet's Mosque. Tell us about your visit there.
I had 2 camels. I had Saudi walking partners. We'd all paused for Ramadan, and I was waiting at a nearby port city called Yanbu, waiting for Ramadan to pass. Fasting also myself, even though travelers, as you know, and pregnant women and sick people are omitted, they're exempted, but I decided to participate as well. And the Saudi government arranged for me to visit Medina, the second holiest city in Islam, especially the Haram area, a very sacred area around the Prophet's Mosque. They made an exception, I'm not Muslim, based on kind of educational purposes, cultural purposes. And it was extraordinary. Basically, they took me there in a car with darkened windows and ushered me into a hotel right across from the mosque. And I was able to witness this amazing breaking of the fast, iftar, with about 60,000 other people after dusk. It was amazing.
So you're not Muslim, but it was at the site where you joined the fasting during Ramadan. Why was it important for you to do that?
In order to kind of even get at the root of Saudi culture, which, as you know, is extremely religious, I think it was a golden opportunity to see one of the most sacred. It was the 9th month of the lunar calendar in Islam. Ramadan is the holiest. It's kind of the holy of the holies. And to be able to be a participant, to be able, as a man who's passing through, right, a storyteller who's walking through, it took me, I think, like close to 7 months to walk through the western deserts of Saudi Arabia, the Hijaz, to be there at that time when thousands of people were breaking fast. There were these big plastic, kind of like tablecloths set out that stretched for many, many hundreds of meters. And you basically sat down and you broke bread, literally, with the person who was across from you, another stranger, often a pilgrim. There were millions of pilgrims in these holy cities at that time.
You must have gotten a sense of the community that kind of moment creates.
Absolutely. One of the purposes of Ramadan, as you well know, is to increase, the sense of community, spiritual growth, but also connection with others, self-discipline, increasing empathy for people who are less fortunate than you are. And I love that month. I love my experience of walking through Saudi at that time, because the world comes alive after dark, right? So people aren't, you can't eat during the daytime. You have to stop before dawn and can only finally break your fast after sunset. And that meant communities, villages, towns were awake late into the night. People, there were street crews doing highway repairs at night when they would normally be doing them during the day. Everybody kind of shifted into a nocturnal mode. It was pretty amazing and quite lovely, actually.
So you said you were in this city of Yanbu for a month. Were you not on the move because of Ramadan?
Yeah, it was impossible because I couldn't force my Saudi walking partners to walk, 20, 30 or more kilometers to the desert. when they're fasting, right? When they're not eating. So partly in sympathy, but also because I wanted to participate.
Yeah, I recall when I was living in West Africa during Ramadan, a lot of public transportation slowed down since a lot of bus drivers were Muslim. Ramadan concludes with the 3-day festival, Eid al-Fitr, the festival of breaking the fast. Fast is obviously broken each night of the month, but this is the big one to end the month of fasting, and accordingly, food plays a big role. Tell us about the people you ate with and what was on the menu.
So basically, I was staying a lot of time in this little village called Yambu al-Nahal, which is a little bit inland from the Red Sea and Saudi Arabia, kind of the whole country. Actually, an old pilgrim road community, a well. And I got to know the family of a local butcher, and the evenings basically were a feast almost every night. We had mutton, we had rice. There were certain food practices. You kind of break your fast with a sip of water and a handful of dates, and then you go at it. Yogurt, fresh fruit, and the idea of visiting other people's homes, going and having dinner with others, your neighbors, was kind of, again, one of these magical parts of this particular holy month.
I mean, these days I'm seeing social media with a lot of Muslim influencers who show off their full smorgasbord of what they're having that evening. Is there any one thing that you remember really fondly?
Well, I was staying with the village butcher, so it was like fresh meat every night, right? So what can I lucked out if you happen to eat meat. It was, again, it's this. There's a sense of celebration. There's this kind of sense of quiet celebration. But now at the end of Ramadan with Eid al-Fitr, it's now just joyous, right?
Yeah.
People were kind of, during the daytimes at this time in this little Saudi village along the Hajj trail to Mecca, people were going around with trays of candies to just exchange with each other's children. It was quite great.
That's so cool. You've walked through several Muslim-majority countries over the first handful of years of your project, as you explained earlier. How do Eid al-Fitr celebrations you've seen in other countries compare to the year you were in Saudi Arabia? Because I imagine cultural differences and factors like conflict and whether there's even enough food to have a celebration can change what Eid al-Fitr looks like.
I think it was interesting because from the Middle East, from kind of the homeland, the center where Islam was born, the Hejaz, right? The two holy cities, Medina and Mecca. I moved into Turkey, and then I did not experience Ramadan there, but then in Central Asia, where there had been 70 or 80 years of kind of Soviet history, and that kind of tradition had been suppressed for generations, it was only starting to come back, right? And so it was a bit more private in some of these communities that I walked through in the stans. But it was still joyous. It just wasn't kind of on the scale with the kind of deep roots that I saw in the Arabian Peninsula.
That is National Geographic explorer Paul Salopek. His project is the Out of Eden Walk. Paul, as always, thanks for being with us.
Always a pleasure, Marco. Thank you.
You can follow Paul's walk across the globe and see some incredible photos online. It's at outofeden.nationalgeographic.org. The World is produced by GBH and PRX, broadcasting weekdays from the Nan and Bill Harris studio in Boston. Find us online at theworld.org and check out more of our original reporting on YouTube. We are at The World News GBH. I'm Carolyn Beeler. Join us right back here for more tomorrow.
The World is supported by the Carnegie Corporation of New York, working to reduce political polarization through philanthropic support for education, democracy, and peace. More information at carnegie.org. By the Lumina Foundation, committed to a fair, universal system for learning beyond high school that offers every American the chance for a better life. LuminaFoundation.org. By the PRX Ambassador Council, whose members include Judy Piggott, the Gruber Family Foundation, the Schmidt Family Foundation, and Gavin Salmonese, LLC. The World's theme music is composed by Ned Porter. The World is a co-production of GBH Boston and PRX.